Hello and welcome back to Spacefood.ca. This is another tutorial about Ableton Live. My name's Aaron Klingbeil, and today I'll be taking you through everything that has to do with the instrument called tension. Now, tension is another instrument that is a collaboration between Applied Acoustic Systems and Ableton Live. And just like the other instrument by Applied Acoustic Systems, this is a physical modeling instrument. So it uses no wavetable synthesis or samples. It essentially just uses mathematical equations to produce the sound that it does. And tension is specifically used for emulating stringed instrument sounds. So I would say this instrument is best for producing like a guitar sound or a violin or cello sound or a dulcimer perhaps, and we'll get to that very shortly. But first I want you to visualize a stringed instrument. So let's think about a guitar. So we've got our guitar, we know that a guitar has strings on it, and those strings are plucked by some kind of material, whether it's your finger or maybe it's a pick or plectrum. And that plucking motion is what sets the tightly wound strings into motion to create a vibration. And vibration is what sound is. So that vibration of the string is very quiet at first, but the movement, the vibration of the string is transferred through the bridge of the guitar and then into the body of the guitar, where the size of the cavity inside will actually resonate or amplify certain frequencies to create this beautiful timbre that we hear when we're playing an acoustic guitar. If we're referring to an electric guitar, for example, then we've got a few other parameters that would help determine the timbre of the guitar sound electronically. So instead of the actual body of the guitar resonating the sounds that the strings are making, instead those vibrations are going to be introduced to a magnetic field in our pickup, and essentially what's going to happen is it's going to create an oscillation in an electrical signal that will then be amplified through our loudspeakers. So there's another characteristic there that will affect the overall timbre of the sound. Now, this is all important to know because what tension does is it does a really great job of allowing us to manipulate each one of these elements that we'll find in a variety of stringed instruments to help us control the actual timbre of the sound, either to create a new sound that is sort of string-like, or to create a convincing emulation of an acoustic instrument. So when you look at Tension's user interface, right away you're going to notice that up at the top we've got two tabs. We've got our string tab, which gives us basically all of our important parameters, and then we've got our filter and global tab, which a lot of these parameters are going to look very familiar to us. Some of them may be new to you, but we'll get to that very shortly. First, we're going to look at the string tab. So you're going to notice that there are these areas here. We've got excitator, damper, string, vibrato, termination, pickup, body, and volume. Right away, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, these are all elements of an instrument like a piano or a guitar. So we've got our excitator section here, which will let us determine what is actually exciting that string. So are we going to be exciting our digital string using a pick or plectrum? Because that has its own very distinct sound. Are we going to be bowing the string like in a violin or cello? Are we going to be hitting that string with a hammer or mallet just like a piano or maybe like a Fender Rhodes or Wurlitzer keyboard? Or maybe are we going to hit the string with a hammer that's going to bounce like a dulcimer? So we've got all of these options here to choose exactly what the transient is going to look like. And then we have options with each one of these drop-down menu options to adjust certain parameters of that excitator. Now, before I get into detail with all of these, I'll just move around the initial interface so that you can tell which elements we have to work with. This might be enough information after I'm done just kind of giving you a brief overview that you can really jump in and start creating your own sounds right away. So if you feel like you've got a good grasp on a lot of these, because the names are fairly self-descriptive, I encourage you to just jump right in and play around with it. If you start getting stuck, then come back to the video and just continue watching until you know this instrument all the way through. So moving in kind of a clockwise position, the next section here is the damper section. So we know that dampening is basically stopping the vibration. So just like if you can visualize inside of a piano, if you've ever opened one up, when you press a piano key down, there's a damper that lifts off of the key just as another mallet hits the note. And so as your finger is held down on that note, it has that damper lifted up off of the string. So then we have all of our options to choose how heavy the damper is and how hard it is, and where on the string it's actually dampening the sound. So down underneath the excitator section, we've got the string section. And basically what this is going to allow us to do is select certain characteristics of our actual strings. So we can tell how long that string is going to resonate before it completely reduces itself to silence. We can also choose its harmonic content, and then we have a few options here for key tracking to adjust these parameters. I'll get into this a little deeper in just a moment. Now, we also have the option to adjust the vibrato of the string. So if you're unfamiliar with vibrato, what vibrato is, it's basically a modulation of pitch. Sometimes vibrato can also refer to just a modulation of volume as well in certain situations. You can also use it as, loosely use the word to refer to modulation of any parameter, but it's typically used to describe the modulation of pitch. So if I'm singing, a vibrato sounds like, oh, essentially. Okay, so down here is our termination section. So this is going to determine how what it sounds like when we're shortening our string. So our pitch on a stringed instrument is determined by the length of the string that is vibrating. And every time we press down on a fret, we're shortening that string, thus creating a higher frequency. And I'll get into these details shortly after I have gone through just a quick overview here. So now this third last section here is the pickup section. So just as I had mentioned before, if we're not dealing with an acoustic instrument, we can use our pickup, which is basically very similar to what we had in our instrument called electric, but we have fewer options here. Essentially, this is going to be an electrically amplified instrument if we have pickup turned on by clicking that square button, and then we can determine exactly where on that string we have the pickup positioned. Now, I think this is a good time to mention to you that certain areas of the string are going to naturally resonate different frequencies better than other areas. So if we have our pickup directly in the middle of our string, so at the 50% mark, you can visualize that that part of the string is going to be vibrating the widest or with the most amplitude. So it's going to be moving away from its 0 point or resting point the farthest, which means that it will be producing the fundamental frequency at the highest volume. Now, if we move our pickup closer to the very edge of the string where it's bolted down or tightened down to a bridge, then that's where we're going to be hearing some much higher sounds, all the higher harmonics of that string. And if you ever get the opportunity to just plug in a microphone and hold it at different areas of your guitar string to tell the difference, it's very easy to notice. Very easy to notice. Okay, so finally, we have our parameters that will affect the characteristics of our body if we're creating more of like an acoustically amplified sound. Now, this is really good because each one of these instruments have very, very different different sized bodies. And the reason why this is so important is because a larger cavity is going to be able to resonate or amplify lower frequencies. And so if we have a piano, for example, you can imagine that those lower frequencies are going to be much louder if they're being produced in or around a piano body than if we had a piano string that was just vibrating in or around a violin body. Okay, so then of course the very last is just our global volume, which we can turn up and down, and that will affect the sound that's coming out of this. All right, so to get into more detail about these different areas, let's start with the excitator section. So this drop-down is going to allow you to choose what your excitator is going to be. Is it going to be a bow? So will we be running a bow across the string, or will we be striking the string, or will we be plucking the string? Because each one of these has very different characteristics to the sound that it can produce. So if we have our plectrum selected, you'll notice that these different variables are going to change, and we're going to have these different options to affect our sound. So protrusion is the first option that we have, and basically what that's doing is it's indicating how much of that pick is being exposed from our fingers, because even a pick will vibrate for a very short amount of time and produce a very small sound. And in turn, that adds to the initial transient of our sound that we're producing. So I've got this hooked up here, so I'm just going to okay, that looks all good. I'm just going to turn that back up to 0, and we'll have a listen to this. So let's start adjusting the protrusion and see how that changes the sound that we're producing. So if you can imagine, as we're moving closer to 100%, it's like our pick is getting bigger, so we're hearing a lot more of the pick sound. And if we move it down to 0, then the pick is getting very, very small. Now, there are so many different types of picks, we might want to choose a different stiffness of pick. So we know that the harder the material, the higher the frequencies that material is going to be able to produce, because harder materials can vibrate at a higher frequency. So I predict that as we turn this knob up, we're going to start hearing a lot more high partials in this harmonic structure. So let's test it out. So not only do we get to hear some changes in our harmonic structure, we also are changing the overall amplitude of our string. So of course, a harder pick is going to be able to move that string a lot farther to transfer energy more effectively. So then, of course, the volume will be increased. Of course, the velocity that we're hitting our string is also going to make a fairly large impact on the sound that we're producing. So let's test that. Quite significant. All right, so as I had mentioned before with the pickup position, if we're plucking our string at different areas of our string, then we're going to be hearing these different frequency bands better if we're either closer to the neck or if we're closer to the sound hole. So let's play around with this. So right now, we would be plucking at 25%, at the 25% mark of our string. So if we move closer to the center of the string, then we'll be hearing more of the fundamental frequency. And if we move closer to 0 or to the edge of that string, we're going to hear higher frequencies. So let's test it out. So as I suspected, we got to the middle of the string. We're hearing those lower frequencies. Whoops. What a difference. All right, so our dampening knob here, which is the last one on the right, this is going to affect how much of the hammer's impact force is absorbed back into the hammer. So essentially, as you increase the dampening amount, the interaction between the hammer and the string will become shorter and generally resulting in a louder or brighter sound. So these parameters like dampening, velocity, and stiffness are also very similar to the options that we have in our hammer section here. So so if we turn this up, it's going to change the sound by making it louder and brighter. So and if we turn it down, of course, it does the opposite. Now, there are two areas here that you may have seen before, velocity and key. So we have the option to adjust these parameters based on the velocity that we're hitting our note. Also, we have the option to modify this characteristic based on the key that we're hitting. So the higher notes will change the value, the lower notes will change the value, and we can do that with each one of these parameters that we want to effect, except for dampening. Now, we do get the option here at the bottom to fix the position of our dampening. So if you can imagine our dampening happening like on a guitar, you're not going to be moving the pick up and down close to the notes that you're actually hitting on your fretboard. Instead, you're going to have your pick struck kind of near the sound hole, and so and that's not going to move. So if you're trying to create a very realistic sounding guitar, I recommend that you engage fixed position. So let's listen to how that sounds. So if I have it disengaged, as opposed to engaged, so it's almost like there are more harmonic frequencies that are being applied to the note if you do not have fixed position applied. But if you do have it on, then it will sound more convincing as an acoustic instrument. So. All right, so in this drop-down menu, we have a few other options. So we have our bow section. So what bow is going to allow us to do is create a convincing sounding violin or cello sound. So let's listen to how that sounds. Wow, that sounds very harsh. So I'm going to turn down the force. And as you can imagine, the force knob is going to affect how hard or light the person or computer is emulating that bow being rubbed against that string. So if you've ever played around with a violin or cello before, you'll know that if you're being very light on the string, it's only going to very slightly vibrate that string, but at a kind of a rapid pace. So then again, there will be those higher frequencies that are produced over the lower frequencies because there just isn't enough energy to get that whole string moving. So if I turn up the force, it's going to create a louder and deeper sound. So here we go. Also a more horrible sound. So I would say be very careful with that parameter. You have a lot of control here, but subtlety. So, of course, the next option here is friction. So, again, visualize with me a bow being rubbed against a string. So the reason why that string is vibrating is because there's a combination of the string sticking to the bow or sticking to the horsehairs, being pulled a certain distance and then breaking loose from those horsehairs. And then you can rub rosin on your bow to help create more friction on your bow. And so what happens is if you've got more friction, then you're capable of pulling that string a farther distance, and then you can create a much louder and deeper sound again. But if you have full friction, it's going to sound more like a synthesizer sound because you don't have that error that's occurring. And then if you have a lower amount, you might just end up getting just like some weird sound. So let's test it out. All right, so that is what the friction knob does. Velocity, of course, affects how quickly or hard we're hitting the note. And after a certain area, it'll cut out, so that is not abnormal. Just be aware of that. The last knob that we have here that we can impact is the position. So where on that string are we going to be vibrating the string? Near the center, of course, we're going to be able to vibrate the fundamental frequency more effectively. And if we're a little bit closer to the edges, then we're going to be vibrating those higher frequencies. So All right, so we don't have dampening control with this because we're not actually using any type of like striking mechanism. So let's move down to hammer. So hammer is just like if you wanted to create a piano sound or just any sort of struck string instrument. And then we have options to adjust the mass of our hammer or mallet. Also, our stiffness. So, what is the mallet made of? Is it a very hard metal or is it covered in some felt or something like that? Then we can choose how hard or fast that hammer is hitting the string. And then, just like the other options here, we have the choice to choose where on the string we're hitting it. So I'm quickly going to adjust this. I'm going to turn it up now that we're not bowing the string horribly. So as the mass increases, it's almost like you can hear the heaviness of the hammer. Stiffness, how hard is that? And then we already know positioning. Okay, so this is my favorite one. And basically, this is just going to allow your sound to bounce a little bit. So it kind of creates an interesting sonic envelope. So with that selected, and if we adjust the dampening, it's going to adjust how much that hammer is going to bounce. Very effective sound. Ooh, I like that. And then, of course, we can fix the position where that hammer is being hit, and that slightly changes the tone. All right, so the next section here is the string section. So this is where we're going to be able to change a lot of the parameters of the actual string that we're using. Now, the vibration of a string is the main component of a stringed instrument sound. So the effective length of the string is also responsible for the pitch of the sound that we hear. So the theoretical model of a resonating string is harmonic, meaning that the string's partials or harmonics are all exact multiples of the fundamental frequency. So if you are hearing gibberish here, I'll quickly describe what a harmonic package is, because a harmonic package is basically determining what timbre our sound is. So if you've used the operator synthesizer, you can create a fundamental frequency, and then you can add or subtract harmonics at any increment that you want. They can be even or odd harmonics if you'd like. So with a digitized string instrument, we're talking about the fundamental frequency, such as 440 hertz, which is actually an A note. The first harmonic of that fundamental frequency will be 880 hertz. So we're taking the fundamental frequency and we're timesing it by the number of harmonics. So the first harmonic would be the fundamental. So 440 times 1 is 440. 440 times 2 would give us the second harmonic, or the first harmonic if we're referring to the fundamental frequency as being the first harmonic. So then the first harmonic would be 880 hertz. And then to get the third harmonic, we would just have to multiply the fundamental frequency by 3, and so on and so forth. I would say the operator synthesizer allows you to affect up to 64 harmonics, which is quite a bit. Okay, so real-world stringed instruments are all more or less inharmonic, so they aren't exact multiples of the fundamental frequency. So we have the option to emulate this inharmonic characteristic using the inharm slider. So basically, it causes the upper partials or harmonics to become increasingly out of tune as its value increases, like that. By default, it's set at 50%. So you're getting kind of a nice balance between full inharmonic and zero inharmonic frequencies at all. Okay, so the dampening slider here adjusts the amount of high frequency content is contained in the string's vibration. So the higher values are going to result in more upper partials, so less dampening. And this parameter can be modulated by the note pitch using our key tracking to its right. So let's have a listen to that. Quite a difference. Okay, so the decay slider here determines how long it takes for the resonating string to decay to silence. So higher values increase the decay time, and then lower values create a shorter decay time. Might be good if you're wanting to emulate plucked strings. And then, of course, to the right of the decay slider here, we can also use some key tracking to affect the overall decay. The next section that we're going to cover is the vibrato section. So basically, the vibrato section can be engaged using the vibrato button there. And the vibrato section uses an LFO to modulate the string's pitch. So if just as a quick recap, an LFO is a low frequency oscillator. So basically, it's an oscillator that's creating a waveform that is lower than our spectrum of hearing. In Ableton Live, I believe an LFO will produce a tone of 30 hertz or below. So we can slightly hear that if we were to just send it through to an amplifier, but the LFO is specifically used for modulating parameters. So in this case, the LFO is used to modulate the string's pitch. So as with all of tension's parameters, the controls in this section can be used to enhance the realism of a stringed instrument model, or you can use these parameters to just create something completely new. So the two most important parameters in this section are the rate and the amount sliders. So rate adjusts the frequency of the pitch variation, and I know we've seen this before whenever we're using an LFO. And then the amount just adjusts the intensity or amplitude of this effect. So the delay slider, which is over here just to the right of the title, it sets how long it will take for the vibrato to start after the note begins. So essentially, if you wanted to add emphasis on a sound only after the note has been playing for a while, you can adjust this delay. So then it'll be more like a sound kind of building up into that vibrato. Okay, so the mod slider, which is right here, it adjusts how much the modulation wheel will affect the vibrato intensity. So this control is relative to the value set by the amount slider here. Now there's one kind of odd slider that you'll notice to the right called the error slider. And what it does is it introduces some unpredictability into the vibrato. So basically creating deviations, random deviations in all of these parameters. So the rate, the amount, the delay, and the attack parameters. Now let's look up into the damper section. So all stringed instruments employ some type of dampening mechanism that basically mutes the resonating string. So in pianos, it's a felt pad that's applied to the string when the key is released. And in instruments like guitars and violins, the player damps by stopping the string's vibration with their fingers. So dampers regulate the decay of strings, but also produce some sound of their own, which is a very important characteristic of a stringed instrument. So, for example, if you were to be stopping a string with a metal spoon, it would be producing a higher harmonic package than if you were using like a felt pad or maybe a piece of leather or even your fingers. Although damper functions to mute the string rather than activate it, it's somewhat similar to a hammer, and it shares some of the same parameters. So the mass knob controls how hard the damper's surface will press against the string. So as you increase the value, the string will mute way more quickly. So here we go. Let me just adjust our decay here. Vibrato. And I'm just going to adjust it back to hammer. The mass knob. So the stiffness of the damper's material is adjusted with the stiffness knob, and lower values will simulate a much softer material, such as felt, while the higher values model a metal damper. So just note that very high mass and stiffness values can simulate dampers that connect with the string hard enough to change its effective length, thus causing a change in tuning. So um, just be aware of that. So the velocity control adjusts the speed at which the damper is applied to the string when the key is released, as well as the speed at which it's lifted from the string when the key is depressed. So be careful with this parameter because a very high velocity value can cause the damper to hit the string super hard, and it can result in like a really loud sound on the key release. So note that the state of the gated switch is what is going to determine if we have control over the velocity knob or not. So basically, when the gated switch is turned on, the damper is applied to the string when the key is released. And with gated off, the damper always remains on the string, which means that the velocity control has no effect. So mass, stiffness, and velocity are parameters that can be further modulated by the note's pitch via the sliders below. So the damping knob here is going to make some fairly unpredictable changes to our sound. So um, basically, it's going to affect the overall amount of vibration absorbed by the damper. So lower values are going to result in less dampening, so longer decay times. But this becomes a bit less predictable as the damping value goes over that 50% mark, because at higher values, the mechanism becomes so stiff that it bounces against the string, just like with our bouncing hammer function here, but instead we have it just in our damping section. Okay, just like the other areas here, we have the choice of where on the string our damper is going to be applied. So, of course, if we have it closer to 0, it's going to be closest to where the string is terminated. And if we have it turned all the way up to 50%, it's going to be near the very center of our string. All right, so let's look at the termination section now. So when we're playing any type of stringed instrument, we're changing the pitch of the string by shortening the string itself. And to shorten the string, what we're doing is applying our finger or some object to the string and then pressing the string against our fretboard or our neck of the instrument that we're playing. So the reason why this is a very important characteristic to include in our emulator is because if we have a very soft termination mechanism, it's going to be absorbing a lot of the higher frequencies that are going to be resonating closer to the termination point of that string. So the parameters of our termination device are listed here, presuming that we are using our finger to terminate the string. So, of course, just like the damper section, we have our mass and stiffness options. So mass is indicating how hard we're able to press that string down. And then the stiffness is basically indicating, of course, how hard our finger is. So if we have it all the way up to 100, we're talking maybe you've got a chrome-covered finger. And then if you've got it turned all the way down, then you've just picked up a guitar for the first time and your hands are baby soft. Now, we also have the option to adjust the stiffness of the fret using the fret stiffness knob. And then, of course, the finger mass and the finger stiffness can be modulated using velocity or key tracking. All right, so next is the pickup section, and this is an easy one to cover because basically it's just allowing us to adjust where the position of the pickup is going to be. So just be aware that the pickup style that we're using here is an electromagnetic pickup, similar to the type that's usually found in electric guitars or electric pianos. So if we have this turned all the way up to 50%, you can imagine that the pickup is near the center of the string where we're going to be hearing the fundamental frequency the loudest. And if we have it at 0%, we're closer to where the string is terminating, which is basically where all the higher frequencies are being resonated the loudest, or I guess the fundamental frequency is the quietest. So we're going to hear a much brighter sound at 0, and we're going to hear a much deeper, lower sound at 50%. All right, so the last section of the string tab, aside from this volume knob over here, is the body section. So we know that the frequencies that our string are producing are then amplified and attenuated based on the shape of our resonant cavity. So basically, the body of our instrument is going to be amplifying certain frequency bands better than others. It will also be cutting out certain frequencies depending on the shape and size of the instrument. So an acoustic guitar, for example, sometimes will have cavities that are large enough to start amplifying those lower frequencies that the string is capable of producing. Now, each one of these shapes and sizes are going to be capable of amplifying very different sets of frequencies that overall will affect the timbre of the sound. So this first drop-down menu here is going to allow you to choose what the shape of our instrument is. So now, to the right of the body selector dropdown, you have the option to choose the size of each one of these bodies. So when you have a larger resonant cavity, it's going to be able to resonate lower frequencies in our frequency spectrum that we're working with. And then, of course, if you have a smaller sized, like extra small, it's going to be capable of increasing the volume of the higher harmonics in our instrument's harmonic structure. So the next knob here that we have the option to adjust is the decay knob. So this is going to allow us to choose how long our body is going to be resonating the frequencies from our string. Of course, the longer the decay percentage, the longer the decay time. So just like a real instrument, our resonant cavity or our body of our instrument is going to either cut certain frequencies if we have a smaller body. And then if we have a very low or a very large bodied instrument that perhaps is made out of very soft wood, it's going to have less harmonic content in the higher frequencies. So we'll be able to cut those high frequencies using the high cut knob. Now this last knob here, STR/body, adjusts the ratio between the string section's direct output and the signal filtered by the body section. So it's basically like a dry and wet knob. So when it's turned all the way to the right, there's no direct output from the string section. And when it's turned all the way to the left, the body section is effectively bypassed. So it's pretty much like just turning that off. So of course, we can adjust the overall volume of our instrument using the volume knob. All right, so if we toggle the Filter and Global tab at the top here, we're going to be presented with some options to control our filter and global controls section. So we're all familiar with this first section here. So our filter is activated by default, and then we have the option to choose one of our familiar filter shapes. So low pass with a 24 dB per octave drop off. So soft knee or hard knee, band pass, notch, high pass, and formant. And then we have our option to select where the filter cutoff is taking place. If we're experiencing a little bit of resonance near the end, near the edge of that filter cutoff to kind of exaggerate the sound of the filter. We can also affect how much the envelope is having an impact on this filter. We can additionally turn up the amount of the LFO and key tracking for both resonance and the frequency cutoff here. So if we want to engage our envelope or LFO to start having an impact on our filter, we can just click that button at the top, and then we can go in and adjust the parameters to our liking. We can adjust the attack, decay, sustain, and release, of course, just our standard ADSR envelope. We can also adjust how much the velocity that we're hitting the note or the velocity of our MIDI clip is going to affect these certain parameters. Of course, in the LFO section, we have the option to choose through just a few of our favorite wave shapes here. And then we can adjust the delay at which the LFO is going to start taking place, the attack, and the rate, either in hertz or synced to our global tempo. So the very last section that I'm going to talk about in Tension is our global and keyboard parameters section. So this section contains all of the parameters that adjust how Tension responds to MIDI data, as well as controlling performance parameters such as the tuning and portamento. So the keyboard section controls all of Tension's polyphony and tuning parameters, so up here, and the voices chooser sets the available voices that we can apply in our instrument. So basically, if I had this set to 32, it means that I could press 32 keys on my keyboard before this instrument stops producing that sound. So I can hit 32 pitches at once, but I can't hit 33. And if I have it set to mono, it will only produce one note at a time. Of course, octave and semi, this is where I can just adjust the overall pitch in octaves or semitones in my instrument. I can also detune it per cent. Down here, the P bend or pitch bend section is going to allow me to choose how far I can pitch bend my note using my pitch bend wheel. So if I have it set to 1, it's only going to detune my note by 1 semitone. And if I have it set to 12, it's going to pitch bend it up to an octave in both directions. So let's test that out. And then down at 1. Now I just hit the wrong note, but it's only allowing me to pitch bend 1 semitone in either direction. Now, if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you're going to be aware of what the stretch function does. So basically what this is emulating is a tuning technique that's typically used on pianos, where if we're tuning a piano using this method, we're actually going to be tuning the higher portion or the higher notes of our piano slightly sharp and the lower notes of our piano slightly flat. And that overall creates a much more brilliant sound. So if we have this set to 100, that's exactly what it's going to do. And if we have that set to negative 100, it's going to create like an opposite stretch. So the lower notes will be slightly sharper and the higher notes will be slightly flat. All right, the next section here to the right of stretch is the error section, and basically what this does is it just increases the amount of random tuning error that's applied to each note. It might be a fun parameter to experiment with. So directly beside it, we have the option to choose what priority our polyphony is going to take. So this is kind of bound with our voices section here. So if we do only have the ability to play maybe 4 notes or 8 notes at a time, when we exceed our 8 allowable voices, which note is going to be dropped out? Is it going to be the lower note that's going to be dropped out, or is it going to be higher notes? So if we know that we don't want any of the higher notes to be removed when we've exceeded our polyphony, then we can adjust our priority. So the priority set here will be the higher notes, but we can choose if we want the lower notes or if we want the last note that was played to be removed. So that's what that does. So the unison section here allows you to stack multiple voices for each note that's played. So the switch next to the name toggles this section on or off, and the voices section here selects between 2 or 4 stacked voices for each note that is played. So while detune just directly to the right of it adjusts the amount of tuning variation applied to each of those stacked voices. So lower values in here will create a subtle kind of chorusing effect, while high values will provide another really good way to approximate like really bad youth orchestra or something similar. Another thing that you should be aware of too is in a piano, there are typically 3 or 4 strings on each note, and a really great technique to create a very brilliant sound is by slightly detuning each one of those notes. So then it creates its own sort of internal chorusing effect, and then creates this like very brilliant wide sound. So this can affect, this can help you emulate that same effect on any one of your instruments over here. So of course, we have the option to affect the delay. So when do these voices come in? We can choose that in increments of milliseconds. All right, so directly below the unison section is the portamento area. So this is basically going to allow us to make the pitch slide between notes rather than just changing immediately. So this effect can be turned on and off by just toggling the switch that's next to its name. So with legato enabled, the sliding will only occur if the second note is played before the first note is released. And so just directly below that, proportional will cause the slide time to be proportional to the interval between the notes. So large intervals will slide much slower than smaller intervals. and then you can disable or enable that by hitting either one of those chiclets that are next to the name. So this time slider is also going to affect the overall time it's going to take for our slide to occur. So 100% is a much longer time than 0%, of course. And finally, the very last parameter is the volume knob. So this is our global section, and it will globally allow us to adjust the volume of our instrument. And this knob is the same in both of these tabs. So there it is. That's tension for you. I hope this tutorial was interesting. There wasn't really a whole lot to demonstrate with this one. I hope that I was also using some good examples to really pinpoint what Applied Acoustic and Ableton Live were going for when they created this stringed instrument emulator. Once again, if you have some suggestions for me, please take some time to fill out the really short survey that's just below this video. There's a link there that you can click on to access that. If you have any suggestions on stuff that you'd like to learn, or if you just would like to offer some constructive criticism so that I can improve my lessons, I encourage you to do so on that survey. And until next time, I hope you have an awesome week, and I will chat with you then.